Well, thank you everyone for coming. I know there seems to be standing room only now, which is really quite nice and never really happens. So I don't know if this breaks the fire code, but I'd be happy if people wanted to sit in front of the table, particularly students and younger folks in the room. So feel free to come up if that's okay with you guys. You can sit here. I'm going to be standing here behind the podium, so I won't move around a lot. So if you wanted to move up here. And while you do that, let me thank the Western Libraries for hosting me today, in particular Peter Smith for organizing this talk, Larissa Mansfield for advertising the talk, and also to the entire library team, really, who helped me a great deal in this book, and they might not know that, and I'm just going to name a few. That's Jennifer McCool, who is there in the back, Margaret Fast, of course, both helped me in securing materials, and I also would like to thank Elizabeth Joffrion and Tamara Belts in Special Collections for hosting us this afternoon. So it's my privilege to be here with you, and of course all the students. I'm glad it's not 70 degrees quite yet, so that you're here. So what I would like to do in the next 45 minutes is to introduce you to my area of research and talk about my latest project, which resulted in the publication of my German language book on the German Jewish writer, journalist, and activist Else Dormitzer. The title of the book, Weiterschreiben, Leben und Lyrik der Else Dormitzer, translated roughly into Continuing to Write, The Life and Poetry of Else Dormitzer, appeared in Germany in the Berlin publishing house Hendrich & Hendrich, specializing in Jewish culture and history, in late 2015. So in order for you to have a better understanding of my work, I'm going to do a few things today. First, I will talk about my teaching and research to illustrate its connections. And then second, I will introduce the life and work of Else Dormitzer for you, or just a little glimpse, before finally introducing the poetry she wrote during the Holocaust and published in a book called Theresienstädter Bilder, Images or Pictures from Theresienstadt, immediately after the war. So let me begin with talking about my teaching and research. And as you just heard, I'm currently wearing two hats at Western. I'm a professor of German in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, and since my arrival here at Western 9 years ago, I've been teaching language, literature, and culture courses on all levels of the curriculum, from 101, the first course in the language and culture sequence, to 450, our senior seminar. And like my colleagues in the German program, my position is that of a generalist, which means I teach a wide range of courses that are not necessarily aligned with my research focus. For example, I teach a class on 18th century German literature. I'm currently serving the German program as German section head, as you've heard, and we have about 8 different sections in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, and they really function like little mini departments. And many of our students are here today, so a shout out to MCL students. The other hat that I'm wearing, and this is also where my particular research interest comes in, is that of founding director of the Ray Walpole Institute for the study of the Holocaust, genocide, and crimes against humanity. The university created the institute in September 2016 to support, expand, and carry forward the mission of the Northwest Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Ethnocide Education. It is named for Professor Emeritus Ray Walpole, who is here with us this afternoon. And until his retirement from Western in 2014, he was the director of the Northwest Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Ethnocide Education. He was a professor of secondary education in Woodring. The mission of this newly created institute, by the way, the only such institute at a public university in the state, is, and I quote, to advance knowledge about the Holocaust and genocide, including ethnic and religious conflict, as well as attendant human rights abuses. What does the Institute do? It supports the study and research of the Holocaust, genocide, and crimes against humanity. It offers public programs, for instance, Noemi Bahn's visits to campus, but also professional development opportunities, for example, for educators. Ultimately, it will also provide new curriculum for you, our students. My research interests are very closely aligned with the Institute. So let me tell you what these are and how I got there. And I'll have a blank slide up there for a moment. Many, many moons ago, I was an international student at the University of Nebraska. and I enjoyed my study abroad experience so immensely that I decided to continue my studies in the US rather than in Germany. In Germany, I was a double major in German and English, but here I decided to focus on German studies, and thus I completed my graduate work in a German department. As part of the curriculum, I took courses on German literature in the 20th century and on the culture of memory. And this is where I became interested in German language representations of the Holocaust in film, art, and in literature, and even more specifically in poetry. While publications on all aspects of Holocaust literature abound in German studies, the study of German language poetry written during the Holocaust in situations of internment has been surprisingly marginalized, particularly in comparison to the multitudes of publications on poetry written after Auschwitz. This distinctive wording, after Auschwitz, inevitably invokes Theodor Adorno and his much debated dictum on the limits of poetic language in representing the Holocaust, which he originally published in his essay Kulturkritik und Gesellschaft, Cultural Criticism in 1949. Questioning the capacity of traditional aesthetic forms to convey the horror of the Shoah in a culture characterized by mass consumption, he specifically directed his critique toward lyric poetry written after the event. Cultural criticism, and I quote, finds itself faced with the final stage of the dialectic of culture and barbarism. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, and it corrodes even the knowledge why it has become impossible to write poetry today, end of quote. Adorno's argument that the rupture in the continuum of German history must not be forgotten and that the limits of representation have been reached within the traditional parameters of art has been both applauded and critiqued. Despite his subsequent explications and modifications, scholars and writers repeatedly narrowed in on the phrase after Auschwitz, often isolating it from its immediate and wider content and reading it, for example, as a prescriptive ban on poetry. As late as 2006, Lawrence Langer observed in Using and Abusing the Holocaust that the after Auschwitz citation remains an authoritative force and has not lost its continuing appeal. While Adorno now plays a far less pivotal role in Anglo-American scholarship, he continues to be influential in German language criticism, and many German language studies on the poetry of the Holocaust continue to frame and position their work in light of these debates. Yet, what by and large has been absent from scholarship are investigations of German language poetry written in the various Nazi camps, ghettos, and prison. Scant knowledge of this writing on the one hand, and a prevailing poetic discourse privileging traditional aesthetic analysis on the other, has prompted the far too general conjecture that poetry written in spaces of confinement mostly consists of clumsy meter as well as dull rhymes and displays inadequate figurative language. While being recognized as human documents or political manifestations, these texts have failed as poetry. Scholar Hermann Korte even questioned, albeit indirectly, the existence of such poetry altogether when he remarked, and I quote, "In principle, the places of the Holocaust elude poetry. The lyrical subject reconstructs spaces of experience and produces images as well as conceptions of the topography of horror and death, but it is excluded from actual experience," end of quote. This negative assessment not only devalues poetic texts written during the Holocaust, but also denies them a representative capability of the l'univers concentrationnaire. For my dissertation, I started investigating the reasons behind this canonical exclusion, and in the process began collecting Dutch and German language poetry written during the Holocaust in the archives of Bergen-Belsen. The Bergen-Belsen concentration camp is located on this map in the northwest corner of Germany, and also in the archives of the Theresienstadt ghetto. That is the second arrow that you see there. To my surprise, not many scholars had done this kind of work before, and many of the texts and writers that I discovered in the archives were and continue to be unknown. Thus, I also began introducing German language texts and their writers to a larger academic audience and offered avenues for reading and interpreting camp poetry. What does my research illustrate? Very generally, it shows that German language poetry from Theresienstadt, and I need to say here that Theresienstadt became the main focus of my work. German language poetry from Theresienstadt can be read as an instance of victim testimony. More specifically, I make the case that current genre theory provides important impulses for the analysis of poetry from the camps, in that it recognizes the fluidity of textual constructions and allows us to read text within broader concepts that ultimately do not oppose but complement each other. In this sense, camp poetry shapes and transforms the generic categorization of Holocaust poetry and broadens our understanding of the diversified text that constitute Holocaust writing. My use of the term camp poetry or Lagerlyrik in German not only encompasses the particularities of textual production and its writers in different spaces and languages, but also acknowledges poetry's various formal realizations, its particular modalities, and its manifold functions within the camps and ghettos. It is important to recognize that this poetry emerged in a spatial, geographical, and temporal proximity to the Holocaust. Within this framework, I offer an alternative to positions in German studies that have deemed German language poetry from the camps and ghettos inadequate representations of the Holocaust, because these texts resist straightforward classification along traditional generic lines. The post-Auschwitz discourse privileged text that displayed postmodernist qualities, such as metatextual, self-referential reflection on the possibility of signification, an emphasis on the in-between of language, and fragmentation of voice and authorship. But poetic texts from Auschwitz necessitate readings that reveal poetry's aptitudes beyond the aesthetic, which cannot be their sole defining feature and critical criterion. Such readings need to illustrate poetry's forms and functions, expanding rather than limiting them to a singular assessment. Little did I know when I started work on my dissertation that I had found a research area that would keep me busy for years to come. I publish mainly in German and English, but some of my work has also been translated to Czech. Well, why Czech? The Theresienstadt ghetto or transit camp, and I will use ghetto, transit camp, and camp interchangeably in this talk for linguistic variation, is located in today's Czech Republic, approximately 70 kilometers northwest of Prague. And here you have a map of Czechoslovakia in 1933 with the arrow pointing to Theresienstadt. In Czech, Theresienstadt was and is a town. It's an old fortress city built in the 1780s, and on the right there you have a ground plan. It operated as a Theresienstadt ghetto from December 1941 to May 1945, and at different times during its 4-year operation it served different purposes. In 1930, Theresien's population was 7,000. In September 1942, approximately 58,000 women, men, and children were held prisoner in a town that measured 700 by 500 meters, approximately 2,296 by 1,640 feet. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Encyclopedia of the Camps and Ghettos, Theresienstadt was, and I quote, originally intended for the Jews from the Protektorat Böhmen und Mähren, and later held Jews from Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, Slovakia, and Hungary. Inmates lived in overcrowded and pest-infected barracks and attics. They died of malnutrition and disease, and were in constant fear of being deported to the east. 63 such transport carried more than 87,000 people from Theresienstadt to killing centers, ghettos, and labor camps in the east. by May 8th, 1945, approximately 155,000 people had passed through Theresienstadt. Some 35,000 of them had died during imprisonment. For a number of reasons, Theresienstadt has been considered an anomaly among the camps and ghettos, one of them being the relative tolerance and tactical encouragement of cultural activities by the authorities. And you might have heard of the music in particular and the children's poetry that was produced in Theresien. Here are just two examples of musical events. Brundibar, the children's opera, was performed 50 times in Theresienstadt. You have the poster there for its announcement, and you also have a sketch on the right hand of the PowerPoint slide depicting a musical evening in one of the attics. But as Sybil Milton reminds us, we need to be very, very careful with this assumption. And I have a longer quote for you. The Theresienstadt ghetto was thus, as we now know, a camp designed as a link in the chain that inevitably led to the gas chambers, and also an elaborate hoax to deceive international opinion. As part of this depiction, the SS tolerated some cultural activities, including theater, music, lectures, and concerts. Other cultural activities, such as art and teaching the children, were not specifically prohibited, but carried risks if discovered. But while we know that Theresien was nothing but a way station to the killing centers, the posthumous fame of Theresienstadt is based primarily on the myth created by this hoax. As in other concentration camps and ghettos throughout Europe, many prisoners in Theresienstadt found artistic outlets to express the traumatic experience of deportation and imprisonment. Some created art to bear witness and to document daily life, yet for others, as Sybil Milton and Marjorie Lamberti have shown in their work, the creation of art served as a temporary flight from reality and as a strategy for survival. Testimonial and imaginative writing in form of chronicles and diaries, as well as cabaret performances, libretti, plays, and poetry constituted an important part of the spiritual resistance against dehumanization. So why did people write poetry? Poetry has long been considered to be one of the most stylized and abstract forms of literary expression, and yet it appeared to have had a most practical purpose for those finding themselves in the confines of concentration camps and ghettos. In trying to understand and translate the new conditions and their imminent consequences, writers not only resorted to a condensed form, but also to a language known and familiar to them. Poetry became particularly important since it allowed a quick and immediate reaction to the everyday, especially when pen and paper were scarce. And even if a first reaction was that of seemingly unspeakable disbelief, experience was eventually translated and rendered speakable and representable in an attempt to voice the void, either on paper or in the mind. For example, as Ruth Klüger states in her widely acclaimed autobiography Weiterleben, and this biography has also been translated into English as Still Alive, a Holocaust girlhood remembered, writing poetry kept her from emotional disintegration, and I quote, "The person who only lives through the events without rhymes or thoughts is in danger of losing his or her mind. I did not lose my mind. I made rhymes." For Klüger and for others who wrote in the ghettos, camps, and in hiding, the creative act of finding and establishing one's voice constituted both a poetic and a therapeutic act. It, and I quote, preserved their identity, reminding them that they were thinking, autonomous human beings. Scholars such as Frieda Aaron, Alan Mintz, and David Roskies, among others, situate the choice for poetry within a particular tradition of Jewish writing, namely as a reaction to persecution and destruction. As Torah and Talmud teach, once evil is witnessed, it needs to be described and reported so that it can be remembered. Just as the camp and ghetto diarists wanted to bear witness to the events unfolding around them, so did many poets. A closer look into the social history of Theresienstadt reveals that poetry took on particular importance among other cultural activities. According to sociologist Hans-Günther Adler on the left there, it was produced in such large quantities that he characterized this obsession as a rhyming disease, in German a Reimkrankheit, and Adler was also imprisoned in Theresienstadt. Philipp Manis on the right, a central figure in the orientation service in Theresienstadt, reacted more positively to this phenomenon, recognizing a testimonial value of many poems, as well as their ability to provide comfort to prisoners and to construct a bond when openly recited. He elicited and collected texts, organized poetry evenings, and called for at least 2 poetry competitions, one in 1942, the other in 1944, each receiving at least 200 entries. The response to these public events shows that prisoners in Theresienstadt valued the opportunity to participate and to recite before an audience if chosen as a prize recipient, while the organizers could count on an appreciation of creative work on the part of the audience. It validated creative work, and the performance created a communal space in which individual experience, as expressed in the poem, could manifest itself collectively as shared experience of the audience. Not all poetry, however, was openly recited. Cultural performances were controlled and censored by camp authorities, and the policies regarding permitted artistic expression underwent frequent change. Art that was too realistic and critical in its depiction was considered subversive by the Germans, and if discovered, the artists and sometimes the community as well were punished, tortured, and even killed. Among the prisoners writing poetry in Theresienstadt was a woman named Else Dormitzer, and I first discovered her poetry a number of years back in the holding of the Beit Theresien archive in Israel. I also learned a little bit about her life in a book by Ruth Schwertfeger, Women in Theresienstadt, and I knew that she was originally from Nuremberg in Germany, where she was born in 1877, and that she had died in London in 1958. But I really did not know much more about her other than this very basic information. Then in the summer of 2008, I was invited to speak at a reunion of Holocaust survivors, the Nürnberg Fürth Survivors Group in New York State. And this meeting was organized by the late Frank Harris, and you actually have a picture of him there. Frank Harris had fled Germany for the United States via the Netherlands and the UK with his parents after the November pogrom in 1938. It was at this reunion in the Catskills that I met some distant American relatives of Else Dormitzer, Claudia Strauss and her mother, and they generously shared a family tree with me. I stayed in touch with Frank Harris, and he later encouraged me to place a call for any surviving European relatives in his annual newsletter, which I finally did in the fall, I think, of 2012, and you have the newsletter there on the right. A few weeks after the newsletter was sent out, I received a phone call from Paris in my office in Miller Hall. A man by the name of Gérard Langlois introduced himself to me and inquired quite sternly who I was and why I wanted to get in touch with Else Dormitzer's family. So I explained my interest to him, and I seem to have made some sense since he agreed to reach out to family members and be in touch again. We exchanged some more phone calls and emails in the following days, and then he indeed connected me with Else Dormitzer's great-grandson in Germany, Thomas Runkel, and her grandson, Henk Haas, in the Netherlands. And here we have a family picture from the 50s. You see Thomas Runkel as a small boy there to the right, and Henk Haas is the young man in the blazer in the upper left picture there. So how did Monsieur Langlois knew the family? It turned out that his father, Robert Löwensohn, was a business partner of Else Dormitzer's son-in-law, Ernst Rosenfelder, before the war. While Ernst Rosenfelder survived the war in London with his wife Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was Else's daughter, and their 2 children, Robert Löwensohn, Monsieur Langlois' father, and his mother, Ella Ruth, were murdered during the Holocaust. In the following months, I corresponded regularly via phone and email with Thomas Runkel and Henk Haas, And they also connected me with other family relatives. For instance, Ernst Rosenfelder's son, Albert, who is now 92, and his children, and they live in the UK. In our conversations, I learned that the family had preserved a wealth of materials. Go back here. In their family archive across European borders, consisting of, and here are some examples, letters, postcards, diaries, among them a diary from Theresienstadt, photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, essays, guest books, books, and so on. And both Thomas and Henk invited me to visit them and their families in Germany and the Netherlands to take a closer look at the family archive. And so I did. And what I learned from these unsorted materials in the family archive and elsewhere was that, of course, there was much more to Else Dormitzer than the 10 poems she had written in Theresienstadt that neither I nor her family knew. While they had preserved the materials, they had not read many of them, and much of what I uncovered was indeed unknown to the Dormitzer's grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So, who was Else Dormitzer? It turned out that Else Dormitzer, born in 1877, had worked as a freelance journalist since the turn of the century and published numerous articles in local, regional, and national newspapers and magazines on a variety of topics. She was also a children's book author. I was able to find 29 children's books, many of them in the holdings of the German National Library. In addition, she translated 2 more into German, one from Swedish, the other from English, and she also wrote 6 new fairy tales. In 1922, when she was in her 40s, she was what appears to be the first Jewish woman in Germany to be elected onto the board of the local Jewish community in Nuremberg. And in 1924, she became most likely the first female member of the national board of the Zentralverein Deutscher Staatsbürger Jüdischen Glaubens, one of the largest Jewish national organizations in the earliest 20th century. Translation would be the Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith, an organization that fought anti-Semitism. Along with social worker Henriette May, and I quote, she played a key role in rallying women to become active members of the Zentralverein. During the 1920s, she traveled throughout Germany on behalf of the Central Association and gave several public lectures. She talked about topics such as famous Jewish women in German history and the necessity of women's participation in the work for the Central Association. She was a passionate public advocate for women's rights at a time when, according to historian Marian Kaplan, and I quote, society expected a smattering of intelligence and polish, but not more from its women. In addition, she contributed articles to the Central Association newspaper as well as to other national weeklies and dailies, including the Berliner Tageblatt, Liberales Judentum, and the Jüdisch-Liberale Zeitung. In 1925, the Central Association published her essay Berühmte jüdische Frauen in Gegenwart und Vergangenheit, Famous Jewish Women in Present and Past, which enjoyed widespread popularity. And, of course, last but not least, she was the keeper and organizer of a house and household in Nuremberg, a mother to 2 daughters, Hildegard and Elisabeth, and a loving and supporting wife of her husband, Dr. Sigmund Dormitzer, a highly respected lawyer in Nuremberg. Like the majority of German Jews at the time, the family identified with progressive Judaism, focusing much of its work on gaining full equal rights and civil liberties without loss of their Jewish identity. They were proud of the accomplishments of the liberal reform movement, seeing themselves as part of the German nation. As Leibel Rosenberg remarks in an essay on the family, and I quote, very naturally, one was Jewish and Nürnbergerisch, cosmopolitan and local patriot, participating fully in cultural and social life in Nuremberg, just like all other citizens, end of quote. After 1933, life in Nuremberg changed for the Dormitzers, and that is not to say that life wasn't challenging at times before 1933. Their daughters had already fled Germany for Hilversum in the Netherlands and London in the UK, and they had long urged their parents to do the same, but to no success. It was only after the infamous Kristallnacht pogrom on November 9, 1938, that the Dormitzers indeed saw the need to leave their hometown. That night, they witnessed the destruction of much of their property, and Dr. Dormitzer, who was 69 years at the time, had to be hospitalized because of severe injuries inflicted on him during beatings at the hands of his attackers. In early 1939, they finally received the appropriate papers and left for the Netherlands, where they resided in Hilversum until May 1940. But soon after the German invasion and occupation of the Netherlands, the German authorities ordered them to move to Amsterdam, where they remained until their deportation to Theresienstadt on April 21, 1943. Dr. Dormitzer died in Theresienstadt in December that same year. Else survived, along with an older sister, and returned to the Netherlands in the early summer of 1945. In Theresienstadt, she participated actively in the ghetto's Office for Leisurely Activities. For example, she gave 275 talks. She also kept diaries, and here you have an example of one of the diaries from Theresienstadt that I was able to see in the family archive. In the middle there is a slide, is a picture of all the talks that she had given during her time, which she wrote down in chronological sequence. And on the right-hand side there, you see a diary entry. What she had also done, this is quite amazing, is that she had compiled her own registry of prisoners, which contains more than 800 names. So you can see this here, alphabetical order, and she noted little characteristics about the people and what happened to them. After liberation, she split her time between the Netherlands and the UK. She became a British national in 1951 and was delighted about it. In London, she became actively involved in the New Liberal Jewish Congregation, where she organized regular meetings for Holocaust survivors. And of course, she continued to write short articles and essays on Holocaust remembrance, mostly for the Synagogue Review and the AJR Review. On June 3, 1958, shortly after her 80th birthday, Else Dormitzer died in the German hospital in Hackney, London. This is, of course, a very, very short summary of her life, and my book goes into much greater detail of her biography, so I really encourage you to read it. Here we have a picture of Else, by the way, in the summer of 1945 that was taken shortly after her return to the Netherlands. I would now like to turn to her poetry for the remainder of the time. In the fall of 1945, the Dutch publishing house De Boekenfriend in Hilversum made available 500 copies of Else Dormitzer's poetry written in Theresienstadt, and you have the book cover on your slide. Her poetry collection opens with a short preface in which she reveals a performative dimension of her poetry by informing the reader that the texts included in this book had been publicly recited in Theresienstadt and that its publication is the result of a promise she had made in captivity. From the beginning, she establishes herself as a direct, credible, and reliable witness of the Holocaust. Simultaneously, she presents other witnesses who attest to her having been in Theresienstadt, to her having written these poems, and for these poems to have been communally recited. Thus, poems and publications serve as printed proof of the actuality of writer and events, a defining characteristic of the literature of testimony. The preface is framed as a dedication to her former fellow inmates, her, as she calls them, companions of fate, which is illustrated by both the opening and closing sentences. To you, my companions of fate of Theresienstadt, I dedicate this little book. With this relationship in mind, I dedicate to you the pictures of Theresienstadt. She speaks to them directly as an implied group of readers, and the use of the second-person plural pronoun euch in the German original expresses not only a plurality, but also a strong familiarity with this group. A few lines later, she defines this familiarity further by alluding to a strong, irrevocable bond because of the shared lived experience of their Theresienstadt past. This bond, she states, is thicker than blood. The verb choice in the opening and closing line of the German original is noteworthy, since widmen, first sentence, and weihen, final sentence, denote two slightly different meanings. even though they've been both translated as to dedicate in Schwertfeger's Women in Theresienstadt. The latter, which can also be translated as to consecrate, signifies a spiritual dimension of the volume at hand, which not only honors the plight of her companions of fate, but also elevates them to a status beyond the ordinary. With this act, she venerates our former inmates, those who survived and who might read this book, but also those who did not. The preface, therefore, serves a threefold function. It establishes her authority as survivor and witness, it honors and remembers her fellow inmates, and it serves as an orientation for a general audience on how to perceive these primary texts. Dormitzer endows her readers with an important message and assigns them a central role in the meaning-making process. The written images and pictures come to life in the interplay between reader and text, and as repositories of individual memory, they extend to empathetic readers outside of Theresienstadt as they become part of a secondary witnessing process. Else Dormitzer arranges the past as a linear sequence, providing a consoling end and immediate closure, the return home. The opening and closing poems, Verzage nicht, Do Not Despair, and I just found a typo, and Finale, create a narrative of redemption in which Dormitzer inserts the remaining poems. Such an arrangement produces a plausible interpretation shortly after liberation, not only for Dormitzer, but also for the reader who reads all text within this affirmative framework. The remaining poems uncover the reality of the barbed wire depicted on the book's front cover and reveal ordinary life in Theresienstadt. Verzage nicht, the first poem, and that's the poem you also have on your handout, and I don't have enough copies, so if you could share that, that would be great. Verzage nicht, the first poem, sets the tone of the volume by describing the bleak circumstances of life in Theresienstadt in general, a life filled with sorrow, constant worries, and pain. The poetic subject is part of a collective whole, expressing a communal voice through the use of the first-person plural possessive pronoun unser. But the reader learns that hope exists to escape this dreadful existence, even in the darkness that is Theresienstadt. Hope is continuously nourished by an inner voice, but an inner voice repeats, "Do not despair, do not despair." The last stanza focuses entirely on revealing the source of strength, and it becomes apparent that is the faith in God to provide peace, freedom, and light. This continued belief will not only be a source of strength and hope, but it will bear real fruit, liberty. Thus, the poetic subject encourages itself and others to remain vigilant in the face of darkness. The comforting mode of this poem, which extends to its formal realization, is easily detectable. The precise and clear language, simple rhyme scheme, and meter provide comfort and support, as the poem provides a general depiction of the experienced. Repetition marks individual stanzas, particularly that of the inner voice, speaking directly and clearly to anonymous whole, guiding them to not despair. It is easy to see how the simple structure of the poem would lend itself to communal use and how a performance would have had the capability to instill hope and strength to soothe the pain, at least temporarily. The volume ends with Finale, and it describes the anticipated event of freedom, the day of liberation. The tone of this poem transforms from one of despair and disbelief to that of exhilaration and praise. The past is immediately perceived as an uncanny, ghostly episode, a Spuk in German. And the poetic subject, again a communal voice, wir, instantaneously recognizes the beginning of a new, a better time. There is no room for further reflection as to what this future might look like, but the poem makes clear who is ultimately responsible for freedom and thus praises God, who has redeemed the people of Israel. The title of the poem underlines the conclusiveness of the end of suffering on the day of liberation. Written from within the events, this poem highlights freedom itself, and at the time of composition, this concept naturally remains vague. Only later will the full picture emerge, along with it the realization that what has constituted home is lost, and that closure will not be attained. At the moment, however, the experience is jubilant and represented as such. Similar to the opening poem of the collection, Finale displays a spiritual mode by being designed as a poem of praise. While Else Dormitzer makes use of a rhyme scheme, it is not as regular as in Do Not Despair, and the poem also lacks some of the lyrical characteristics of the first poem, for instance, repetition, organization, and stanzas. It might therefore lend itself less for performance and ritual, and is a different realization than the first. The remaining poems are inserted within this narrative of redemption. The reader learns about 6 recurring and concrete themes of daily life in Theresienstadt: hunger, work, death, pests, torture, and deportation. While all poetic texts hold on to meter, rhyme, and versification, they display modes and functions extending beyond the testimonial, lyrical, and spiritual. The poem Wanzennacht, Night of the Bedbug, for example, in which the nightly hunt for lice and other pests is depicted, is primarily satirical, and as such functions as a critique of the terrible hygienic conditions in barracks, rooms, and attics. The poem Transport shows the agitation created by rumors of deportations and subsequent deportation announcement, describing the nervous restlessness of those deemed to leave and also of those staying behind. Wann wird man wohl die Nächsten holen? When are they going to get the next ones? As in other poems, Dormitzer creates this tension by transforming verbs and stringing them together as nouns in a series. Such a grammatical adjustment maximizes expression within short verses. It also has the added effect of concreteness, as the new nouns articulate actions and feelings more effectively and broadly. Additionally, Dormitzer employs the figure of the Grim Reaper to represent death as a constant companion of prisoners, here waiting beside the train tracks. She relies on traditional poetic imagery and quotations in other poems as well, for example in Tod in Theresienstadt, Death in Theresienstadt. Dormitzer not only depicts the process of dying and bodily decay, but she chronicles what happens to the dead after, and I quote, "some poor soul ascends for home," end of quote. While this line evokes Joseph von Eichendorff's romantic poem Moonlit Night, Dormitzer has changed the subjunctive mood of the original to the indicative. Eichendorff's construction has lived on in German culture ever since it was first published in 1837, and to bring it up here seems absurd and out of place. And perhaps that is precisely its function. Whereas Eichendorff's text exalts the romantic's artist's experience of nature and beauty in the context of death, the construction of death as mass murder serves to distance Dormitzer's poem from the original. Death is a reality, it's a regular occurrence, and the body is quickly prepared for immediate disposal and stripped of whatever personal valuables might remain. The use of a regular rhyme scheme in the German original renders the poem even more unsettling. Apart from Finale, the poem Volkszählung also depicts a particular day in the history of Theresienstadt, the infamous census on November 10th to 11, 1943. Here, Dormitzer inserts a short prose description before her poem to contextualize the specific event within the history of Theresienstadt. In 8 stanzas, she chronicles the tortuous events of the day, the endless hours of waiting for young and old without food and water before being able to return home to the ghetto. For 2 other poems, Dormitzer explains the meaning of particular words in the context of Theresienstadt, the words glimmer, mica, and Nachschub, reinforcements, also the title of the poems. The latter focuses on the lines people endure to receive an extra serving of soup, whereas the former depicts work in the mica factory, a job mainly completed by women. Just as Nachschub, this poem also underlines the strenuous nature of everyday life and how the individual experiences abuse on a daily basis. Dormitzer arranged the poems she had written in Theresienstadt into publishable form between the summer and fall of 1945, shortly after she had returned to the Netherlands. She presents the Theresienstadt past as a linear sequence, providing a consoling end, freedom, and immediate closure, return home. The opening and closing poems create a narrative of redemption in which Dormitzer inserts the remaining poems. These, as I've tried to illustrate, uncover the reality of the barbed wire depicted on the book's front cover and reveal ordinary life in Theresienstadt. The poems are characterized by the immediacy of experiencing the Holocaust as it affected the writer and her surroundings. and by their conventional parameters, providing structural security in which to situate the experience of persecution, deportation, and annihilation. The preface establishes Dormitzer as a credible and reliable witness who shares her work with an audience interested in completing the act of secondary witnessing by receiving her poetry. She dedicates her book to her fellow inmates, thus creating a textual memorial with which she honors the dead and the living alike. At the same time, the collection reaffirms her own position as she now confronts the post-war period. Else Dormitzer's poetry, I would like to conclude, serves as a salient and poignant reminder of the range of German language camp poetry, contributing to the writing of the Holocaust in general, and to the writing of Theresienstadt in particular. The poems produced in this particular setting are distinct textual representations of its time and place, linguistic and artistic renderings of experience. Just as there exists a number of competing memories of an event, so will there be a variety of forms trying to represent memory of that event, each form passing down its own distinct kind of memory. The poems written in Theresienstadt constitute valuable repositories of individual memory and play an integral part in the collective writing and remembrance of the Holocaust. Thus, recognizing poetry's potential rather than limiting its modes and functions, it's perfect timing, can only add to our understanding of the writing of the Holocaust. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. So what did I talk about? I had another slide, but you know what I talked about. I really thank you for listening so attentively, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have about this presentation. So thank you. It seemed, yeah. Yes, we'll start with you and then, yeah. Okay, so I have wait, I'll go back here. So there's a question of what I did with my major when I came to the United States. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me to study English when I came here and be another English speaker when English is not my mother tongue. And so I had a great professor in a German department, and I decided to continue studying German. I thought that made a little bit more sense at that time. So it had nothing to do with being easier or more difficult. I think at that point it really had to do with the class and the professor that I had. Keith, yeah.
So I just wondered if there was anybody's looked at differences in poetry at different camps and locales and peoples and what and how some of those differ.
Yeah, so Professor Hyatt is asking a question about the different poetry written in different camps and sort of the differences and the similarities. And this is a question that we could spend a lot of time on, but the short answer is yes, people have looked at this, but not really transnationally. So it's more like we look at this one particular camp and then sort of analyze the poetry that's taken in, or that was written and produced in that particular space. Now, it really depended on what kind of a camp or ghetto this was. A lot has been done in Yiddish language, for example, on the Polish ghettos. So there have been Frieda Aaron, for example, worked extensively on that. Within a German context, some of the German camps have been looked at in Ravensbrück, for example, which is located in Germany. It had a lot of Polish prisoners, so there was a lot of Polish women particularly writing poetry. So yes and no. I think there's still a lot to do and a lot of ground to cover. Yeah. Leah.
Somewhat related to that, actually. What are some major stylistic differences that you know of between Yiddish poetry and German language poetry written during?
So the question about the differences between Yiddish language poetry and German language poetry. And I think here, again, we have to be very cognizant of the situation of internment that poetry was written in. Even in Theresienstadt, we can see a difference in the topics and forms between the Czech and the German prisoners. I'm going to answer this question slightly differently. So within Theresienstadt, for example, we have a high number of elderly German Jews deported to the camp. So they grew up with a very different tradition of German poetry and had a very classical upbringing, many of them. So it seems to be the case that there we have a lot of what we would call more traditional poetry. For the Czech language poetry, we had a lot of younger Czech inmates. And the poetry also is much more avant-garde in a way. Now it also, of course, relates to who was able to understand what language and where was there room for criticism, for example. Since most of the Nazi officials that were in Theresienstadt did not speak Czech, there was a much higher chance of having kind of critical works being written and displayed. Now, in terms of Yiddish poetry too, I think there you will probably find many more religious and not as secularized forms as you will find in Theresienstadt and in that German language poetry. So if you are interested in that, and I had some reading recommendations actually on one of the slides, but Frieda Ehren's book, Leah, is really a good book to pick up on Yiddish poetry. Emily, yeah.
I have two questions. One is you spoke about how the poetry from the camps was generally ignored after the Holocaust, and I'm wondering if there's a role of anti-Semitism and/or anti-communism that played a role in ignoring that work. And I also wonder about Else Dormitzer's having been a women's rights activist, whether those politics, whether you saw an influence of those politics in the poetry that she was writing.
To answer the second question first, so is there an influence of sort of the political work that she did, if I could see that in her writing of poetry? No. The question would actually relate quite well to the children's books she has written. So it's really quite interesting to see, because a lot of her children's books are written in rhymes and verses. So I see more of a tradition there as being very apolitical, and we can talk about what that might mean politically. But she doesn't mention that in that poetry in particular. So it does not come up in the Theresienstadt poetry. As to why this poetry was largely ignored, there are different reasons for that. I think one has to do with the aesthetic debate, and Adorno, I alluded to that, that there was a focus on other forms at that point, and we wanted to find a break from that past, and that also meant a break from traditional forms. But yes, you are also absolutely right that German history played into that as well, in terms of, for example, wanting to deal with that kind of poetry on a different basis would have required to ask different questions. So it might have not been particularly related to anti-Semitism, but more to Germany dealing with its past immediately after the post-war and a refusal to do so. Yes?
Were there any other camps besides Theresienstadt that had a lot of poetry coming out of them?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. It really depends on the different camp or ghetto. Thank you for that question. So when I started in Bergen-Belsen, for example, when I went into the archives to look there, there was a lot of Dutch poetry that had written, but nobody had written on. So my assumption is that, yes, if you look for a topic to work on for your master's degree or your PhD in German studies and history, there's a lot to do. Mm-hmm. Yes, Veronica.
Are Else Dormitzer's children's books easily accessible, or they were just in the country's archive?
Oh, this is a perfect question to ask in the library. So, because we spent quite a bit of time trying to get them through interlibrary loan, and they didn't lend them. So I went to the German National Library in Leipzig and actually found most of them there. Hank and Thomas also had 1 or 2 books each. But Margaret and Jennifer did a great job of trying to help me finding and getting these books here, but we were not successful. But it wasn't too bad either, so I just had to go to Leipzig into the library. So hey, nothing wrong with that. So is there one more question, or? Okay, Clarissa.
You mentioned that her family, a lot of what you discovered in your research was stuff that they didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about their reception to your book, or some kind of exchange you had with them that is noteworthy, and about how they reacted to what you found?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It was quite the process, as you can imagine, and so it was great visiting them and them letting a stranger into their house and going through their shoeboxes of materials is really quite astounding. So they were very receptive, they were very helpful, they were very supportive, they were very interested, and we had great conversations that were also very difficult to have. So I think for them even more than for me, discovering that family history, of course, had a very different dimension for them. They've been very receptive to the book, and I'm still in touch, particularly with Thomas, who has a great interest and knowledge of Jewish history in Germany and of literature, and he's just a source of information. And so they've reacted very positively, and I could have not written this book without them, quite simply. So, and that's where some of the pictures that I had there, these amazing documents I found that they had kept. For example, the letter they got from the Jewish Council in Amsterdam announcing their deportation on April 17th. They had to come in the next day. They still have that deportation letter. Else could not, for example, let her family know that her husband had died. So what did she do? They had kept a card, which was a receipt attesting that she had received a package of food in Theresienstadt. She was not allowed to write anything on there, but she sent it on December 9th, so after he had died, and she just signed it as Widow Dormitzer, which would have told her family at that point when they got it that their father had died. So these kind of documents, they had kept letters, and of course it's a very difficult conversation and a very difficult time, and they haven't read some of it because they don't want to. They don't want to read the diary. And then I shared what I found with some family members, and then others did not want to know. Yes, one final question. I think quite well. So German studies has improved, and there's a small group of us that works on this kind of topic, and it's still a little marginalized, but you know, change is slow sometimes. So, but it's received well. So, good. All right, I won't keep you much longer. So if you have more questions, stick around. But thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.